Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. Welcome back to Feminine Roadmap Podcast, the podcast that helps you navigate the challenges and the changes of midlife and helps you live a more vibrant second half. If you find us today on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss any more conversations. And if you're driving and listening on a podcast platform, please remember to subscribe, rate, and share. Today, we're going to be talking about self-sabotage. My guest is going to talk about these layers of self-sabotage and why is it that when we know what we need to do, we don't do it, and how do we break through and become more consistent. My guest today is Tanja Shaw. She is a functional health and nutrition coach. Tanja, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, Gina, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation. It's a topic I love speaking on, and I really hope that it's going to reach your audience.
You know, it's one of those things that's kind of a hot topic at the moment, and I'm really interested to hear about what is it that drew you to this particular topic?
Oh, well, good question. Long story. You know, I started my health journey, excuse me, when I was in my teens and 20s, and I loved the way exercise made me feel. And it really got me into loving the body science side of things. And I eventually got my kinesiology degree, started working as a kinesiologist, and then started personal training. And at the time, I thought everything was about, the best workout plans and, here's how to eat. And at that time it was very, leading into the low, first with high carb and low fat and then low carb and all of the things. I was really great putting together plans and protocols, and clients would get results, but they were never really able to stick with it for the long term. And personal training is very personal. And I got to know my clients very, very well. And I realized that there was something missing between the knowing and the doing, and also just our enjoyment of the whole process. So a lot of times we were either, we had this all or nothing thinking, we were on, we were off. We had a very rocky relationship with food. We were like, hating on ourselves and judging ourselves and not happy with ourselves. We're always pursuing the next, the 5 pounds, the last 5 pounds. And at the same time, I was also struggling with my own very disordered relationship with food and body and weight loss and exercise. I was overdoing it. I was always on this pursuit of, just getting to be a smaller size and dieting and being very restrictive, but then realizing that my own struggles with food were not just my own. And so many people were struggling. And I was just wanting to find that gap and fill the gap between the knowing and the doing, but also not just white knuckling it and thinking that it's always about willpower and, pushing harder and harder, because we all have real lives and we only have so much capacity and bandwidth to work on, changing these habits. So it was back in 2015 that I really started to reject the whole diet model of just, here's the plan, here's the protocol, and started really working on the mindset side of things. Mm-hmm. And now I feel like we all talk about mindset. However, most places don't actually teach you how to change your mindset and how to change your thoughts. They just talk to you about how it's important and, just stick with it, or just have more, more grit. And most people are aware that they need to get the right mindset, but they're left with, well, how do I do this? So that's what spurred me into this. And I just saw a need for my own personal journey, and then also those who I worked with. And I wanted to do something different.
I think it's fascinating that it really is a common thing that people go through. Like even high achievers, let's call them, right? They struggle as well. But to your point, there's a shift that we need to make. And I'm curious, how do you help people identify its self-sabotage in a positive way? And then what steps do you walk people through to get them through it, to break through it? Because it's so automatic, right? It's just happening to us. We don't even realize it sometimes.
Absolutely. And it's not ever just one thing.
Yeah.
And that is where I start with, is starting with the definition of what self-sabotage actually is. Because we often say, well, it's self-sabotage, or we say like, I'm sabotaging. I actually don't use those words very often, except for when I'm speaking like, in big topics like this, because this is how we speak. We say I'm self-sabotaging. We say it's self-sabotage, but self-sabotage really is just when you're not doing the things you could do, should do, want to do to reach your goals and to be more in alignment with your future self, the future self that you want to be.
Yeah.
And so, for example, it could be, I said that I was going to, stop eating after dinner tonight, and here I am with a bag of chips and a glass of wine, and being like, well, F it now, I had done that, I might as well just go all out. We call that self-sabotage. But if we take out the word self-sabotage, all we're doing is we are saying we're going to do one thing and then doing something different. So I don't know if it's actually like self-sabotage. I don't think it's an accurate measure or an accurate term, because I don't think we're doing it because we actually want to harm ourselves. It's just that we're not following through on our promises to ourselves. I also like taking out those words, because when we say things like, I'm just so inconsistent, or I just self-sabotage, it's really hard to solve the problem because it's so vague and so big, and there's no clarity as to what the problem actually is. So without that clarity of what the problem actually is, it becomes very hard to solve it. Same thing, often we say things like, I'm just so stressed, I'm just so overwhelmed. But that's also very hard to solve, because what is it? Is it a perception? Is it the fact that you're going through a really big part of your life right now, and is it the fact that, or is there layers of like that not enoughness that's layering in, and self-doubts? Like there's all these factors that can be very vague when we're just talking about things like stress and overwhelm or self-sabotage. So I think the first step is to get a better definition, and then start to define what it actually is and what does it look like for you, so you have some clarity before you can actually start solving the problem.
It's kind of like an integrity issue, right? Like, are we showing up for ourselves? Right? Are we holding, like you said, are we keeping our promise to ourselves? It feels like a huge integrity issue. We always show up for, or we often strive to be there for other people, even to the detriment of ourselves, right? And yet we struggle to prioritize ourselves in the same way.
Exactly. And Gina, you said something actually that's really important there. That's that integrity piece, because we often talk about the pain of, like, a lot of my clients come to me initially because they want to lose weight, and we realize it's never ever been about the weight loss, and it's just really the byproduct of taking care of yourself and having a better relationship with yourself. But one of the pain points that we don't talk about is not having that integrity with yourself, being incongruent or out of alignment with the person you want to be. And we talk about the pain of, missing out on life because your joints are sore, because you're carrying extra weight, or because you don't want to get up and down off the floor, or traveling is hard, or whatever it is. Sometimes it's a confidence thing. But what we don't really talk about, and it's hard to articulate, is that pain point. It's a low grade pain point, but it's there all the time when you are out of alignment with the person that you want to be. You want to be a fit, healthy, vibrant person. You want to be that kind of woman who takes care of herself, who, makes the better choices, who is joyfully disciplined, who's kind to herself, and has the honesty piece and everything. But yet when we are constantly not living in alignment like that, it's a pain point. And for so many women, we have a pretty bad relationship with ourselves. Not everyone, but when we're honest and when we start to dig deep, there's often a lot of negative self-talk. There's a lot of putting ourselves down, and sometimes it's really obvious, and sometimes it's just so insidious you don't know that you're doing it. And I wonder sometimes, like, no wonder we don't like ourselves, because, well, first, we're not nice to ourselves, and then we are always breaking not always, but we often break promises to ourselves. And if you had a friend who always put you down and never kept her word to you, you would probably, hopefully, stop hanging out with that person, because why would you want that person in your life? And that's what we do to ourselves all the time. So you're right. A big part of it is the integrity piece.
I've thought a lot about this myself, because sometimes I feel like it's fear, right? The thing we want is also the thing we're the most afraid of. It doesn't have to be as massive, but I agree with you. I think when our brain sees something as too vague or kind of just too out there, it's like we want something, but like you said, we don't see how that can happen. And our habits currently. You know, they say the habits you have today aren't going to get you to the person you want to be tomorrow. But I do feel very strongly that in agreement with you that if we know, like we cognitively understand, wow, I'm really missing the mark here, whatever it is, but we have no real concept of how to get from point A to point B, especially if our habits are so opposed to maybe this thing that we say we want to do and be. I mean, do you understand what I'm trying to communicate? It's like just that incongruency that you were talking about, that lack of alignment with. Sometimes I think the incongruency really is, to your point, that lack of knowledge.
Yeah, and sometimes we're aware. Sometimes we're almost like we ignore those things. Sometimes we kind of put them as like, oh, it's not so bad, or I'll deal with that later. And you said something actually that's really, I want to circle back to that. That's the fear piece, and fear comes up a lot. And it's like sometimes we're afraid of failure, we're afraid of success, we're afraid of the unknown, we're afraid of uncertainty, we're afraid of the work. We don't even know what we're afraid of. We're just sort of swimming in this sort of pool of fear that we don't even know what it is. And that's actually one thing that when I talk more about the layers of self-sabotage or not following through and promises yourself but consistently. A lot of times it is the fear piece, and there's lots of what ifs. And our brain is there to keep us safe. And we have these sort of unknowns. And it often is the fear of successful. What if I'm successful? Here's when it comes to weight loss. Like, what if, like, often we have weight loss as being, it's kind of like our scapegoat for not doing the other things in our life, because we're like, I'll do that when, or we have this idea, and it's almost hard sometimes, these fears, to even articulate, because they're so deep that it's hard to put words onto them. They just exist. It's like an operating system on your computer. Like, you don't see it, but it's like it's the platform that everything runs on.
Yes.
And you might have a problem with one of the applications, but it has nothing to do with the application. It's also to do with like your operating system.
Yes.
Kind of like that. And it's sometimes they come up, right? And we don't even know that they're often it's because of past things that happened to your past, stories that you were told. It doesn't always have to be. A lot of my clients have had pretty big things happen to them in their life, traumatic events, but it doesn't have to happen like that. It could just be that someone said to you, or a belief that you adopted. I mean, a lot of our beliefs came up when we believed in Santa Claus back when we were 8 years old, and then we just keep reinforcing them into our adult life. But the fear one is huge. And that one comes up a lot. But again, it's hard to work through it without starting to identify like what actually is the fear. And this is one of the tools that I use a lot. And you probably am not the first one to ever share this, but it's journaling is powerful because you get the things onto paper and it becomes so much more concrete, and it becomes something that you can actually solve versus this sort of ambiguous, vague thing that's circling in our head and we're swimming in it, and it feels very just like a big storm without having that clarity piece.
Yeah. I love that you talk about our standard operating system, because I have a coaching client right now that I literally just used that that analogy with just last week, because we do have, I know we're talking about this idea of not having integrity with ourselves, but there's honesty with ourselves. Like, for example, if our operating system is to do just the bare minimum, or other people are more important, or, I'm not worthy, or whatever, there's 1,000 things that we could stick in that standard operating system. But there's this integrity piece. So we want to get in alignment, and we have this standard operating system. And in order to have integrity, I feel like the honesty piece with ourselves is really important. Not in an aggressive, like argumentative way with ourselves, but being honest with ourselves. I think sometimes we hang on to goals because we're supposed to, right? And we're not accomplishing them because we don't actually, somewhere deep inside, it's no longer in alignment, or it's maybe directed in the wrong direction. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like learning to be honest with ourselves and say, is this what I really want?
Totally. It is important, because we do have lots of the shoulds. And I see that a lot more as, the women I work with are generally 50 plus. But I think sometimes we've had those shoulds for so long, then you start to really ask yourself the questions. But honesty is important. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think it's a really, really important piece of all of this. As a coach, it'd be so easy if I could just say like, oh, that's right, that's wrong, you're doing the right thing. But I have no idea, because it really comes down to like the best advice I can give and the best coaching I do with my clients is to help them start to seek their own truth and to be honest with themselves. Because honesty also comes up from sometimes where we almost sometimes give ourselves up. Like, let's say we do have a goal. And this is why, like I said, a lot of my clients come for weight loss, but ultimately it's like other things that's underneath. But sometimes we also are not honest with ourselves, because we give ourselves like these passes where it's like, oh, that wasn't so bad, or I'm better than I was before, or you know what, like I get like, I that was still a win because of it was better than it was before. At least I didn't do that. Like, we have these sort of statements to kind of, and while it's true, and I think that we want to be like celebrating our wins and we want to be reinforcing things that we're doing, but sometimes we're also not also calling ourselves out when we know that there's a level for us that we want, and we're just sort of, and that's, like I said, it's really hard to distinguish, when am I being compassionate with myself, and you can always be compassionate with yourself, when am I just sort of recognizing like now's the time to rest or not worry so much or whatever. And worry is not the right word, because we don't want to worry about it either way. And when is it time to rise up and to actually challenge ourselves and to know that, no, like that is important to me, because we sometimes also might want something. And this is where it's so complex. There's so many layers. We might want something, and then we'll tell ourselves it's not important because we don't believe we can have it. Or because, so this is again, I know I wish I could just say, well, I wish there was like this like 5-step process that we can work through, but it really comes down to a lot of journaling and questioning and reflecting and being honest with yourself, because it's not a straightforward process.
I would say that growth is never a straightforward process.
No.
It moves you forward, but in a very a very
Sideways
wild
way. Up and down and around and loop-de-loops and everything.
A little bit wonky, but you'll get there. It's interesting to me how there's common challenges that we have. Like, to your point, everybody's path is different, but we're all talking. It's kind of like we're all talking about this one topic, but we all have a completely different map to get there. And I think when we struggle to find our own way alone, it can be more difficult sometimes. To your point, journaling is by far one of my favorite strategies for myself and for other people, because our brains are so full of thoughts and ideas, right? And we put stories, where it's like we're building something in our brain, right? We have an idea or a thought, and then we start building on it, and we start creating a story. We start creating a dialogue or a narrative around these things. And depending on who we're in relationship with, that narrative could be challenged or it could be supported, right? So I think that as we are processing these things and putting them out on paper, it's good to see what you're thinking, right? Not just think it, but see what you're thinking, and then having someone
concrete.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Otherwise, I think when I think about the storm in your brain, like that's what I think of it. So it's like, then there's clouds, and then because it's just a mix of emotions and thoughts and pop-up thoughts and past stories, and you don't even know it's true. But then, and the thing is you think something, and then it creates a feeling, and because you create the feeling, you think it's true, and then you just or you feel something, and then you create the thoughts to, match the feeling, and it just becomes very, 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 very messy. When I was just listening to I think it was on Instagram or something, someone said that, when you have a really hard math question, what do? You write it down. So why we should do the same when it comes to our, our personal problems too.
That's a great analogy. Like trying to do math. Sometimes math in your head is a piece of cake, and other times it's like, why is this so hard?
You can do simple things for sure. If it's hard, get down.
So to your point, do the simple thing, right? Write it down, get it out to where you can grapple with it, thoughts or things. And until you make it a thing, meaning write it down, it's kind of hard to deal with it.
Totally. It's like the dream when you wake up from your sleep and you almost remember your dream, and then the closer you try to remember your dream, like the further away it gets. So you're like, it's like that. So I find it really helpful to write things down, and it's a great process.
Now, you mentioned that often when people come to you for weight loss, it's very rarely about weight loss. Can you expand on that concept? Because I feel like it's probably more broadly applicable.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people want to lose weight, and there is no shame. I could frame that differently, but like, I want everyone to have permission to want what they want, because often we like are ashamed because we gained weight, and we are ashamed because we want to lose weight because, others have, there's just like, there's so much shame. Like, stop. Give yourself permission to want what you want. And weight loss can be a wonderful goal to have, but it becomes one of many goals. And the reason why it's important for that, first of all, is because we got to start to wonder, like, what is weight loss going to bring us? And we'll, and make sure that we know why we want to lose weight, and we understand what the weight loss actually brings. Because often we think, well, I want to be confident. I want to be, all these kind of things. And it's like, well, you can lose the weight and not be confident, or you can lose the weight and love yourself, but have it be a very conditional level. I love myself only when I'm a certain size, and that's it. You can be in a smaller body, but still have now, waiting for the other shoe to drop, and just kind of being and living in fear, wanting or being afraid that you're going to gain the weight back, or still being anxious around food and parties and celebrations. So it's a good goal. It's one goal, but it's one goal out of many. And I think we have to keep that in context. And for a lot of my clients too, when they come to me and they start losing some weight and everything, which is great, but then their desire to lose weight actually goes down a lot for a lot of women too, because they're just like, and not to say they still don't want to lose weight, but it's not the same. They just have so much more of a better relationship with themselves that I'm not losing the weight because I now want to love myself. I already love myself, and I just want to take better care of myself. So that's, I think, a big part of it. And I look at weight loss as a natural consequence of you taking care of yourself. And we actually don't know what we're supposed to weigh. Like, who knows? I can say I want to lose 10 pounds, but who says who? Like, I could, but what is it going to cost me? And how much of an effort is it going to be to do that? And is it worth it? So when you go at it from a place of like, I'm actually taking care of my body and doing the things that are right for me, then your body's going to do what it's going to do. Now, with that being said, this is also why I really got into the functional health side of things, because a lot of my clients were really getting great mindset shifts and starting to feel a lot more calm and peaceful and making better choices, but we're still not losing weight. And I wanted to just look under the cover as to what's happening from a gut health, hormone, immune function, digestion, detoxification, all the things, just to see how I can best support them, because sometimes there are physical things that are getting in the way from your goals. Like, for a lot of women in their 40s to 60s have thyroid dysfunction, and it may not be a diagnosed like hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's, but a lot of women do, or they have candida overgrowth, or they have, this sort of like cortisol dysregulation, which just makes it harder to lose weight. Or for a lot of women too, and I did not realize this when I first started working with them, for a lot, that they were under eating for way too long and trying to go to these 1,400 calorie, 1,500 calorie diets for years. And then we're wondering why they weren't losing weight. And sometimes they're not losing weight because on average, they were eating a lot more, because you try to do 1,400 calories. You can do it Monday to Friday. Weekends are like, all bets are off, because you are, we can't sustain that low of calories for if you're an active, full grown woman. You need food, right? So it's that side of things too. So it's looking at both the mindset pieces and then also the body side of pieces as well to, get to where you want to go, and knowing that there is no arriving of anywhere that you're going to get to, but it's just all about, continuing on.
As you're talking, I'm thinking about, if we're focused on that external thing, right? The number on the scale, the dollar in the wallet, the whatever. On some level, now we've put our worth, our value on something else. And all of those things can change and be taken away.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So I think that the psychology of what you're talking about, in my mind, is maybe the fear is born out of I can't control that, which is true. I cannot control the job. Sometimes I can't, like menopause, our bodies do things that they didn't do before. And I cannot control it. I can make choices. And I think maybe that would be a shift, at least in my mind, that could help. Instead of being like A, B, right? Like that's over there and it's overwhelming, or I'm intimidated, or I don't think I can do it, or whatever the story is, to your point, that's running in the background that is hindering our ability to see a way through, number one, and hindering our motivation to try because of fear, number two. I like to ask questions to jog the pattern, right? Like to disrupt it and say, okay, isn't that interesting? Like what that was an interesting thought. That's interesting. Or, what's my next best step? That's over there. Like right now, what do I want to feel, or what do I want to accomplish? And I feel like while there's, like, to your point, I understand as a coach, I don't know what people are supposed to do, but I can help them navigate whatever their journey is. But I feel like asking ourselves better questions, or even beginning to ask ourselves questions, not the ones that we ask, like, why are you doing that? Why are you being stupid? Not those questions.
No, ask better questions for sure. Not the ones that are actually helpful. No, I love that you brought that up. I use questions a lot for myself and also in my coaching, because I think it was John Maxwell that said, like, the level of your life is determined by the level of your questions, or Tony Robbins or someone said that.
Yes.
Because it's true. It really is. And this is where, again, you ask your questions. It gets you to, questions start to bring forward your higher thinking brain, which I love. And it gets out of your emotional brain of just like, I want, the temper tantrums that we can be having sometimes. And it also makes us slow down, because sometimes we just operate on these systems that we've been operating on for so long. And I think we've all had that experience. You kind of just do what you've been doing because you've always been doing it, without popping your head up and asking yourself, like, well, is this what I want? Or is this still my truth? Or what else is true? I think it's really, really great. You said there also about the sort of, what do I need now? And I think that's a really helpful mindset too, because sometimes it's going to be different from seasons to seasons.
Yes.
And, we might be sometimes in a push phase. Sometimes we're in a kind of a recovery phase. It's all good and it's all different. And we get to do a little bit of all of it. And also what you said there about sometimes how it feels so overwhelming because the thing seems so far away. And you're right, we don't have control over it. And we never did. This is where I think COVID was so hard for so many of us, because it was so in our faces that we don't have control. And we never did. We like to think we do, and we can control, certain things, or, within our best. But for example, for weight loss, you can't control. You can't control the number on the scale. You can influence it. And we sometimes worry so much about what's going to happen, 5-10 years from now, next year, and am I going to stick with it? And that's a complete waste of energy, because it's completely irrelevant. Like, it matters. What happens 5 years down the road does not matter at all.
Right.
Because all we can ever focus on right now is right now. And that's it.
Yeah. And essentially the 5 years is in that, isn't it? Right. In other words, if I'm worried about 5 years from now, the question then is, what can I do now?
What can I do right now?
Because the 5 years is going to come, but then 5 years never gets here. Technically, every day that 5-year mark just keeps moving out a day. Right.
Yeah. And then the other side of that too, sometimes the 5 year feels so far away that I'm not going to do anything now because I have so much time. And that's, again, why it's so good that we start to kind of continue to stay focused on what we can do today. They give so much more clarity and peace, because this is, like, ultimately what we have the most control over is what we can do today. And that's it. And talking about the control piece too, I think it's really helpful just to recognize, like we're all going to fail. We're all going to have fears. Like, you don't have to overcome fears to start or to take, like, the fears can come along for the ride. It's all good. We're not to think that we need to be fearless or anything like that is, I think, a goal that's not going to be achieved. So let's not even worry about that. It's just, do it anyway. And that's why it's so great just to stay focused on what can I do today. One of my favorite mantras for myself is I'm going to do the best I can. And that's all I can do. It's like, because it is, I can, and same thing for weight loss. Like, don't we stop ourselves so often before we even start because of the fears of the what ifs or putting ourselves first or investing money or whatever it is. And it's all we can ever do is what's happening today. That's it.
There's a question that sometimes is helpful. It's like, what's the worst thing that can happen if I try? Like, what's the worst thing can happen if I make this one little change? And maybe that's it, isn't it? Right, Tanya? It's the volume of the change. Like, how big, how loud, how disruptive is this change in our mind? Right? Because change, it's back to the standard operating system. It's got us on a good locked and loaded system, right? Back to the safety, the control, whatever we see it as. But to your point, we really don't ever have control. We don't ever have complete autonomy. So if we can focus on what we can focus on and remove the things that were maybe less controllable, I don't know what the right word is, but it's like removing your plate, right? Like clearing your plate of the things that are sucking your energy or making you feel out of control or triggering that self-sabotage, because, that's the word we're using. What's triggering us to avoid what we say we want? And I think we're dancing around this issue, and I don't think that there's a solid answer, but I do think that the idea of these greater things, outcomes, like even in weight loss, I mean, you can speak to this, of course. We can say, I want this number on the scale. And for example, I got really sick with a thyroid disease 20 something years ago. And I lost so much weight so fast because I had hyperthyroidism. I had Graves. And now from a healthy state, I look back and go, well, now I know what I look like at that number on the scale. And it was horrible. Like on a chart, it could say, oh, at your height, this is the lowest you should weigh or whatever. So that number was technically on this chart somewhere. But I guarantee you, I looked like I was starving to death. You know what I mean? So I feel like it's a very small example. But my point is, sometimes what's in our mind, what we think is going to be satisfactory, or what we think is, to your point, way like early on, make us happy. Right? I love that we're talking about happiness. Okay, happiness is one of those, like what
things. The more we chase it, the further it goes.
So you said something very profound, which is this moment is what we have. This decision, this feeling, what do we want right now? Maybe if we're not so focused on that big, scary whatever in the distance, that is one of the strategies to setting it aside. The other thing that you said that I really love is the goal is not to be fearless. I love that. The goal is not to be fearless. That's impossible, right? But if we can, back to the integrity and honesty piece, admit that we're afraid and just get curious about why. What are we afraid of? Have you ever, that question's an interesting one. It's like, what am I afraid of? What's the worst thing really that can happen? And often it's all a boogeyman. It's not a real thing that could happen.
Yeah. I use that question a lot actually, as well as what am I afraid of? And because, when we talk about the kind of the underlying deeper reasons of the self-sabotage cycle, often it is a deeper fear. For example, like I said, it could be if I lose the weight, now I no longer need to worry about like have this problem. So what am I going to do with all my thought energy, my life energy? If I'm like, I sometimes women are like, I need to go do something profound and something huge with my life. I'm like, well, no, you don't. You can actually just do nothing. It's totally fine. Like, or, in the past, maybe when they were losing weight, they were getting some attention.
Yes.
And, I remember one of my clients, she's like, "Oh, every time when I lose the weight, I feel like I can't say no to this one person." I'm like, well, you can lose the weight and say no. Like and that's until you actually write it down, it becomes like almost like you can kind of think it in your mind, you can argue yourself in your mind, but when you write it down and you get the truth really out, it's really quite powerful. But I love that question, Gina, that you brought up, is what's the worst that can happen? And I use that question a lot, especially when it comes to sometimes making investments or, if you're investing into a coaching program. And a lot of people who like my coaching programs are an investment. I'm not, I think it's a wonderful deal. You get so much, but it's an investment for sure. And for a lot of people, they don't take action. Like, they'll say it's money, and money is a continuum, like, and some for absolutely it is. But often it's not, it's the unknowns. It's the, can I do it? It's the, am I worthy of it? That gets in the way, because the worst thing that happens, like, well, let's say if you lost a couple $1,000, like, and that was the worst case scenario, would you still be able to retire? Would you still be able to like put food? Like, yes, like most people would, but it's often like it's the fear of failure. Like, I don't know if I can handle that, with myself again. Like, what if I try and I really try and I don't succeed? Here's another one that comes up. We kind of half-ass try because we're afraid that if we really try and it doesn't work, then what? Then what are we left with? Then who are we? And that was a reason why I didn't start my online coaching business for years. I wanted to for years, but I had this fear that what if I actually really tried with something that I wanted and it didn't work out? And so instead of answering and writing down, because one of the things I recommend doing is like when we have all these what ifs, right? Like, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What we do is we have all these what if, but we never take the time to answer them. And to your point of that question, like, what's the worst case scenario? Like, write down all of the what ifs. Like, well, what if I fail? What if I just wasted $3,000 or $2,000? What if I, what if I lose the weight and can't keep it up? What if I start gaining the weight back? What if I go out on vacation and, there's just write it all down and then respond to it. Like, what would you actually do? Because then it becomes less scary, because, that whole question, like, what's the worst case scenario? We are more afraid, I believe anyway, I don't know if there's going to be a study on this, but I think that we're more afraid of the unknowns than we are of the worst case scenario. For people who are waiting for test results back from, like, so let's say had a biopsy on the rest or gaze, the waiting period is so much worse than actually, even if it was the thing, like the negative diagnosis, because now they can take action, now there's clarity, now there's something they can do, versus this sort of like just this ambiguous waiting game of like, well, what if, and that often stops us. We stop before we even start because we have all these what ifs.
And this is where what we think is so important. And the journaling helps our thoughts become reality. In other words, standard operating system, the thoughts we think, the beliefs we have, they're all in there running our life. And when you write it down, it becomes real to you. Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, now that I see it, you're like, well, that's dumb. Like, what in the world? I
know. Like, and I want to just reiterate that there is, with all the thought work we do and all the work that I do and you do and all the work that we, like, my clients have done for years working with me, there is no place also where we never have to do this work ever again.
Oh my gosh, isn't that the truth?
Yeah. And I say that, like, because often, like, for example, yesterday I was having a bit of a low grade intrusive thoughts were coming up. Like, they weren't like full on there, but I could just tell. And I could tell with how I felt. I could tell with how I started to become a little bit more argumentative with my husband. And I found it so interesting how when I'm not feeling good, the first thing I want to do is to push him away versus,
Yes.
like, and I caught it pretty quick, and we had a really, really great conversation last night, and I brought him in close, and which was really good. Because there's a couple things going on in my life, and I've had some challenges with business as well. And there's so much, even with all the thought work, even with everything that I do, even with you post all a lot of the great things are happening, but there's still so much self-doubt, and there's still so much well, what ifs. And the thing is, when you think about the what ifs, if we lose all of our income, we're still going to be fine because I'll go live with my parents. If you, sometimes when you think what's the worst case, it's actually not that scary. But often what we just swim around in this sort of low grade fear, and without ever getting clear what it actually is. And I think for a big part, for a lot of us, it's, what does it say about who we are? What if for the struggles in my business, I'm my kind of my second business, the coaching I've been doing has been now almost 4 years. But we've had some really big challenges in the last little bit, just things have just changed, and you foreshadow and you catastrophize. And the biggest fear probably is, does it mean that I'm not enough or I'm not successful? And I think that's where, if we're honest, and this is where the honesty piece comes in, a lot of the times we don't fully put our 2 feet in and jump full into things because we are afraid of that. What does it mean about us? And this is where there's so much of the mindset stuff that goes in. There's so much of the actions and everything like that, but it's real, right? It's at least it's even if it's not real, it's it's real to us. It feels real.
But you made a couple of really good points. What does this mean about me? Who am I if this doesn't work? Will I be a failure? Well, how often do we actually take the time to really define what is failure?
Totally. It's
right. And what is success? In other words,
success is the other question. And what makes it, and if we're afraid of not being enough, then what is enough?
Yes, the questions. It's the questions. It's so what I'm saying then is I'm not enough now. I don't get to be enough until I reach some certain arbitrary keyword benchmark that I've made for myself. Or even an arbitrary benchmark somebody else has made for us.
Totally.
We put so much weight on these arbitrary things that really are, if we're going to get existential, which I'm not technically an existential person, but it's what I've done is I've forfeited the present for an unknowable future when I self-sabotage, because I'm making a decision not to do something now because of something that may or may not happen in the future. Because everything that happens in the future is based on something I do right now. So by not doing now, I'm essentially making my negative thought thing become more of a reality. Whereas if we ask the good questions and be honest with ourselves and keep evaluating, is that really the target that I still want? Because I feel like a lot of the times, especially the older we get, not everyone recalibrates. Right? The what was successful at 25 may look very different.
Totally.
45, 55, 65. But
what you said there about how we sometimes don't act now because of the future goals, it's and that's just it's so, even if it's not what we want, the familiarity of it is so much more comfortable than the unknowns of what ifs. So I think that was just really
the familiarity of
even the familiar with the things that we don't want. Let's say it's the emotional eating or the stress eating or the overeating, whatever. That's more familiar than the unknowns of going forward.
So what I hear you saying is sometimes we stay with the familiar.
Totally.
Even if, but then doesn't that take us back to the honesty piece?
Mm-hmm.
Because what if we say, I actually like having 15 Oreos with milk at midnight. I don't really like Oreos, so it's a fairly inaccurate, but you know what I'm saying? What if we were to turn and face that, whatever it is? What's the worst thing that can happen if you admit you like to eat a bag of chips? I mean, we know this is not a great decision in the long haul for your organs and your body, but if we step it back and just go, what's the worst thing that can happen if you admit that you like it?
Yeah.
Right? If you just land on it and go, in this moment, I'm choosing. That's what I like to help people recognize, is that it's a choice. Nobody's holding a gun to your head, that you're not powerless in this situation. You're choosing, right? Do you know what I'm saying? Like the process of really recognizing that if our habit is to run to food or to whatever it is, we need to be honest with ourselves that that's what we've chosen. I mean, maybe we were taught it, but now we're choosing to do X, Y, and Z. And it's really on nobody but us. And if we choose to do it, why beat ourselves up? Why don't we just tell the truth?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because that's what we do. We beat ourselves up. And then it's like, well, that makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
This is not it's not effective. I don't know if it's ever worked for you, but it doesn't really work for me.
It doesn't work for you because then you stress eat and you emotionally eat because you just beat yourself up. Or you over restrict and go the other way too.
Mm-hmm. I do like that thought. You know, that the comfort zone is, but it's honesty, right? Being honest with ourselves that this is, yep, I've been doing this my whole life. Don't really like the results, but I kind of like it in the moment. And then sit with that for a minute, like.
Well, you could have two truths, right? Like often this is why the mindset piece is so important and the conversations with ourselves is so important because we often stop at, I like that, I want that, and that's it. Like but then you're like, but I want to lose weight. And then you beat yourself up because you think you shouldn't want or shouldn't have done it. It's true that you might like, well, not you, but you might like the 15 Oreos with milk at nighttime. You might like overeating. You might like numbing out with food. You might like mindless eating food while you're eating the couch. You might like that, which is fair. Emotional eating works. Like it does. It takes us away from the emotion. It soothes us. And it could also be a great, like sometimes it could be a wonderful coping mechanism because sometimes life is just can be so hard. All that's true. We're not denying it. Often we just start to try arguing ourselves. But what's also true is that you might want to take better care of yourself. Or what's also true is that you're going to be learning how to make slightly better choices. What's also true is that if you are present with the Oreo cookies, you can eat 5 and get a lot of pleasure out of it. What's also true is that you'll feel better the next morning if you just have 1 or none and go to bed. So it's not denying the truth because those are truths. It's just about starting to look for other truths and trending towards the truth that's going to move you forward, which isn't always our first thought. I don't know about you, but my first thoughts are often not the ones I want to keep.
Which there's room for pause then, isn't there? Like one of the tools that I've used is like, to your point with your husband, the example that you shared is like catching yourself and being honest with that moment. Like, oh, why do I feel like doing X, Y, and Z? Learning your triggers or your patterns and catching yourself and just pause. That's where that's interesting. That's where that question comes in handy, where it's like, okay, that was interesting.
Instead of just blaming him for the things that he was doing, which was really nothing. I know it was all me, but it does take honesty to do that because we don't want to admit those kind of things, right?
Well, again, to your two truths, right? Yes, we do, and no, we don't. So where do we land to get to the destination that we're headed for? Yeah. So if you had 3 strategies that you could share that would, encourage listeners, because we've really talked about a lot of things. We've skipped rocks in some ways, right? You and I both know that the depth of we could do episodes on each like leg of this conversation.
I agree. It is very, very deep. I think a big part, it starts with clarity. If I was going to come up with a couple of different strategies, is clarity is the first part, is like, what is getting clear on what you want or what you don't want. And it could be also include the weight loss side of things. It could be like clarity, I think, is one of our superpowers in terms of getting, because when we have these vague goals, I've been like, I'm going to eat better. I'm like, what does that mean? Because it's really hard to say, to wake up and say, like, I'm going to eat better today. It's too vague. So on a granular level, clarity is really important. So today, like, what am I actually doing today to make progress towards my goals? And what are my goals for the long term? And the longer term goals can be a bit more vague. They could be more like, I want how you want to feel and something like that. But I think clarity is really important. And even when you define clarity, sometimes we stop ourselves because we don't think we can get there. We mentioned that in the conversation. So questions could be like, well, if I believed with 100% certainty that I could do anything I wanted to, and I would be successful, what would I want? And it's a really good question, because often we come up with these goals, and I do this as well, and probably in business health, that you make them smaller sometimes just because you don't believe it's possible. And again, this is like where it's really like there's two sides and two ways to look at this. Some are like, well, start small, start doable. And some are like, well, are we just holding ourselves down because we don't believe we can do something else? And that there is no right or wrong answer for that. And that's where the honesty comes in. But then the other point too, so that clarity piece is really important. And it doesn't have to be an arrival point where like, oh, now I have to find my goals and I'll never have to revisit them again. It's going to be a work in progress. It's going to be something that we're going to keep redefining. I do also really, really like the what ifs. And so if you're struggling with the, stopping yourself before you're starting, or investing, or getting a coach, or doing that next thing, we often don't do it because we haven't responded to the what ifs. The what ifs are just sort of swimming around in our brain, and we've never actually written them down and just said like, well, this is what I would do. I'd reach out, get help. I would, all these things. So the first one is clarity. The second one is the what ifs. And the third one, I mean, there's lots. We can go forever, but I think a really important thing too is to just, we talked about this on the call today too, is to focus on the present and today. I recommend focusing on one day at a time, and for two reasons. One is because every day is different, and your goals for today might be different than tomorrow, because tomorrow is a different day, and your goals have to match the reality of your life, because if they don't, it becomes really hard to stick with them, and we wonder why we're not making progress, because we're not matching the reality of your life. And the reality of your life isn't always just the external things. It's also where you're at in terms of your mental state and your capacity to make changes. Because for a lot of people, they think it's a time thing. We're not, like, coaches will say this all the time. We all have the same 24 hours in the day. We all a workout's only, was it 4% of your day, or all this like nonsense. It's true. But most people don't struggle with time, although some do. Most people struggle with bandwidth. They struggle with the mental capacity to make the change, because turning off food at nighttime, shutting down the kitchen, takes no more time than snacking all night. Like, yes, maybe it takes more time to prepare like a whole bunch of vegetables at home and stuff like that, but it's the bandwidth. That is the heart, the thing that most people have, and it's not always. And sometimes the bandwidth is like just our own mental, like, battling back and forth. So clarity, starting to answer the what ifs, writing it down, and then focusing on one day at a time, because the goals for your day have to match the reality of your life. And then the other part is so that you focus on one day at a time, because quite often we just set these goals like, I'm just going to eat better, I'm just going to lose weight, I'm just going to like build my business, I'm just going to have a better relationship with my husband, or whatever it is. But there's no actions each day, and there's no focus on it every day. So then we wonder why we don't get there. It's like, well, maybe that's why. So that's one thing I do every day is I touch base with my goals, I connect to my goals, and then I plan my day, focusing on the one day at a time.
Fantastic. So Tanja, how can people get a hold of you? Where can they find you?
If you listen to podcasts, the best is my podcast is called the Fit and Vibrant You podcast. It's on iTunes and Spotify and Google Play and all the places where you find podcasts. And then if you go to my website, which is tanjashaw.com, TANJASHAW.com. My name is spelled with a J. That will link to all my blogs and podcasts and all my social media links as well.
Awesome. Well, Tanja, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today, for having this powerful conversation with me, and for sharing so honestly and openly the messiness of the process that we're talking about. That you didn't deliver this like a 5-step program and then people still feel like a failure. So I really appreciate your honesty and integrity in the conversation, but as well as sharing that you also walk along this journey so that you've leveled the playing field, made it less mystical. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you. I'm glad that came through, because that was one of the worst things we can do, is that we start comparing ourselves to this made up place that doesn't exist, of what we think things should look like. It is messy. And you're right. I am on this journey all the time. Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. Friends, today, if you find us on YouTube, just look down below. The links will be right there to Tanja. If you are on a podcast platform, you can also head to www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 352, and the show notes will be there. This conversation, friends, is one of those that doesn't go away. It feels like it's a multifaceted part of our life. And no matter where we're at in life, these questions, these doubts, these fears will rise. And this conversation today is a reminder that this part of the human journey, this is part of the human process. And so if we can learn to be honest with ourselves, to walk in integrity day by day with who we are, question what we want, question what we think we want, ask better questions, evaluate, adjust, dig in. Like Tanja said, let the fear sit in the car, maybe move it to the back seat, and keep moving forward. Each day is the day we can make a difference in. The difference we make today is going to impact the difference we want 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years from now. So I would really encourage you to get together with friends and have conversations around these things. Find the support that you need to make the changes that you want to make, and have some grace and gentleness with yourself. Don't ride yourself like a horse. Just take the journey as it comes, celebrate your wins, and ask good questions when you come up against resistance. Thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to sharing more interesting people, strategies, and conversations with you in the weeks to come. Take care, my friends. Bye-bye.